So in this video, I want to talk to you about random orbit sanders. I've already talked to you about that before, some of the limitations and advantages of random orbit sanders. So I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to be talking more about buying, because a random orbit sander makes sense as one of the first power tools you'd want to buy. And the sort of the basic model you'd want would be a 5-inch, so that refers to the diameter. A 5-inch plug-in random orbit sander. You're going to find all kinds of good machines at reasonable prices, and it's going to get you into the power sanding game. Not perfectly, as you recall, because random orbit sanders tend to leave swirl marks on the wood. The best you can do is to work through the different grits and sand with a light hand pressure. The heavier the hand pressure, the more the swirls show up. But this is a good style of model to get. They usually have a built-in dust collection system, a bag, or in this case, this is hard plastic, but it's porous plastic actually. The air can go through this plastic, but the holes are fine enough that it acts as a sort of a filter. So not a whole lot to think about there. Unless you're tooling up to do different kinds of sanding other than your woodworking sanding in whatever shop space you have. If that's the case, if maybe you've got a wooden deck that you like to keep refinished, or you've got some other outdoor wood projects, that's where you're going to benefit from some more power. So the 5-inch, it's a good sort of light to medium duty machine. But a tool like this, for instance, this is a 6-inch random orbit sander. So the diameter of this thing is 6 inches instead of 5. Doesn't sound like a lot of difference, does it? But this is much more powerful. And it actually has a bigger sort of orbiting action, a bigger diameter to the orbiting motion. What that adds up to is much more aggressive sanding action. So probably twice as much. I mean, I could cover twice the ground if I'm sanding a deck or preparing a gazebo for finishing. I could get through twice as much with this as I could with that. Now, the drawback, it's going to be more expensive. And mostly, the biggest drawback is that there's no built-in dust collection in the 6-inch random orbit family. I mean, there may be. Maybe there's the odd machine that I don't know of that has some sort of built-in dust collection, but mine, I have a couple of 6-inch random orbit sanders. None of them have built-in dust collection. And because they remove so much wood, they can kick up a lot of dust. So that's the drawback. You get more power, costs more money, but then it's also a dirtier tool. So you might want to use it outside, for instance. And that's not a bad idea. I have a shop here. I have dust collection. I have an ambient air filter, the whole thing. But I still like to sand outside because sanding's dirty, and I want to get as much of that sawdust as I can outside. Please don't be confused about a tool like this, for instance. I mean, this doesn't look a lot different than that. You wouldn't think, well, what's the difference? The difference is huge, actually. This is what's called a quarter sheet finishing sander, and it gets its name because it takes a quarter of a typical sheet of sandpaper on the platen. But whereas the 6-inch random orbit sander was twice as effective as the 5-inch, I would estimate that this is probably at least twice, maybe even 3 times more effective than this sander. This sander is not meant for removing anything like large amounts of wood. This is a finishing sander. It even says right on it, finishing sander. So that means it's very gentle, and it doesn't remove a lot of material. And that's actually a good thing. You don't always want to be removing lots of material. I bought this, and I've used it for hundreds and hundreds of hours. The main use for this is sanding between coats of urethane, for instance. As I explained before, it raises the grain, gets a little bit rough. This knocks all that roughness down without actually going through the urethane, because you don't want to remove the urethane that you just put on. The 5-inch random orbit sander would definitely remove all the urethane you've put on there as you sand between coats, so that's no good. They look similar. They're not. Random orbit sanders always, always, always have round platens, and they take round abrasives. Finishing sanders like this never have round platens, and they hold their sandpaper on with these little levers here. It's kind of a clamp arrangement, and the paper goes in here like this, and then clamps it down. That's the easiest way to tell them apart. If you're going to buy one sander and you don't have a deck or a gazebo or any outdoor work to finish, the 5-inch random orbit is going to do the trick for you. One more thing. This is a 5-inch random orbit sander, and it's cordless. It takes a battery, and that is an advantage in some situations. The drawback is, and to be honest, I think the drawback is serious enough that you as a beginning woodworker would not want to bother with something like this, but I want to introduce it to you anyway. The drawback is twofold. First of all, it's going to be much more expensive. This one's going to be much more expensive than this one, even though they do the same amount of work. They're about the same power, so more money for the same output. That's one thing. And then the batteries add a fair amount of weight. I mean, this is a very big battery, but even a battery half that size, it adds a fair amount of weight. So this is heavier and more awkward and not as well balanced as a corded model. But sometimes cordless is just the ticket, because some people don't always work around power. If you're refinishing the woodwork on a yacht or something like that, and it's out in the middle of some yacht storage yard, that's where something like this might work. I've used this sander lots of times when I'm up on scaffolding and I'm sanding some woodwork, and I'd really rather not fish a long cord up there. That's a valuable use for this too, but I still consider it something of a specialty tool. There are not a whole lot of random orbit sanders that are cordless right now, and I think they're going to remain more or less a specialty tool because of the cost issue and the weight issue. Like I said before, if you want one, just get an ordinary plug-in model. You can build your sander collection from there.